Can you believe the SEGA Saturn is now more than 30 years old? And what better way to reminisce about the console than to have a list of arguably the finest genre on the console, the fighting game. Put simply, there were so many fantastic brawlers at the time, and we're going to be looking at my favorite 25 that I've been playing over the years. I've had a blast making this video. Let's get started.
It's out there.
So kicking off the list is Cyberbots from Capcom, and you're going to be seeing a lot of Capcom games on this list. Now, Cyberbots is a mech fighting game in the ilk of Street Fighter in 2D with mechs. However, I think that to say that it's just Street Fighter cash-in is a little bit of a disservice here, because actually the sprites are incredibly well detailed and the animations are incredibly pleasing to watch. And this is a surprisingly deep, fun game. Sadly, it was only released in Japan, like unfortunately many games on this list where the Saturn was far more successful. But if you missed this one, it's definitely worth a look at this game because it's something that feels very unique on the Saturn. Number 24 is Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. Now, why would this be on the list, I hear you ask? I mean, it was on the SNES, it was on the Mega Drive, but the Saturn version, having missed out on Mortal Kombat 3 because of an exclusivity deal with Sony, the Saturn version is probably the best version that you can play. And when I played this, which was actually only a couple of years ago, I happened to pick this one up fairly cheaply, I realized that all of the sprites and detail and backgrounds is just so much better than the 16-bit counterparts that I played. And of course, there's that CD quality sound. The game is a huge amount of fun, and really this is one of the better ways to play this game. So if you have a hankering for classic Mortal Kombat, you can't do a lot worse than Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 on the Saturn. Number 23 is Marvel Superheroes, and I remember being completely blown away by this game back in the day, and it's because of two characters, Juggernaut and Hulk. To be honest, until the Saturn came along, you just had never seen sprites this big, this detailed on the screen, and it really was incredibly impressive to see. To be honest, it's still impressive now. The Saturn version ran so smoothly, in line with the CPS2 arcade board, and was just so much better than the PlayStation version that couldn't really handle such sprite work. So this really blew my mind back in the day. Now, unfortunately, the Versus series means this is a lot lower down the list than it should have been because they were stronger games, but if you want to see where it all started, and just looking at the footage of Juggernaut here, you can see why this was so impressive back in the day. Groove On Fight is actually the third game in the Power Instinct series, which was made by Atlas, who are now obviously owned by Sega, and this I think is a real underrated gem on the system. I only actually found out about this game a couple of years ago through a friend. It's not groundbreaking, it's fun, it's fast. I really, really like the graphics and the sprite work. I think there's almost like a cel-shaded look to the character sprites. They look really, really detailed, and this is a lot of fun to play. It's not the most testing game, but it's very, very easy to pick up. It's a great tag team 2D fighter, and if you have missed this one, I definitely recommend you giving it a look. Another Japan-only game next in Pocket Fighters. Now this is Street Fighter, but shrunk down to mini fighters, just like the ones that you saw in Puzzle Fighter. Now sadly, this did not release in European and US shores. It did make it to Europe on the PlayStation, but actually this is surprisingly fun, and actually not just Street Fighter shrunk down in terms of gameplay. I think once you've got your head around the fact that Chun-Li can yield a gun, and actually the difference in the gameplay. It's a surprisingly fun little game that you can play, and it even keeps the theme of the puzzle fighter where you have to collect gems to power up. I had a lot of fun with this one. Definitely don't overlook this just because there are stronger Street Fighter games on the system. Pocket Fighter is one that you should definitely take a look at. Asuka 120% is another very quirky Japanese fighting game. And the thing that I love about this is it doesn't try to be too flash. The fighting mechanics are surprisingly easy to pick up and surprisingly fun. And actually, whether you are new to fighting games or very experienced, you can have a lot of fun with this one. And in fact, even as recently as 2020, this has been used in community fighting tournaments, and I think has actually become a far more well-regarded game than actually at the point of release. You'll see the static backgrounds, and I think it just didn't have the wow factor that many of the 2D games that really pushed the Saturn did have. But there's a very deep fighting game here. Virtua Fighter Remix is up next, and it's a shame that this one had to exist, because the reason this existed was because the Saturn original port of Virtua Fighter was pretty poor. It ran slowly, there were all sorts of technical issues, and it was nothing compared to the Model 1 arcade board. Fast forward, and obviously you can see you have texture mappings and more detailed characters, less slowdown, and a far more complete version of the original Virtua Fighter, which actually I think really makes this one stand out. It's certainly not as good as the sequel, but it certainly is a lot better than the original offering that Sega put out on the Saturn. If you want to see where this one all started, wouldn't go for the original Virtua Fighter. Virtua Fighter Remix is definitely the one to pick up. Number 18 is X-Men Children of the Atom, and very much like Marvel Superheroes, this is a game that was sort of superseded by the Versus series from Capcom. It was one of the earlier CPS2 arcade conversions, and I think was overlooked at the time like many 2D games because everybody wanted the shiny new 3D and actually bypassed an excellent 2D fighting game based on, of course, the excellent X-Men franchise. So I'm surprised this one wasn't more successful. It's still great to play today. It's fast, it's fluid, just like you would expect from a Capcom 2D fighter. Samurai Showdown is a game that should need absolutely zero introduction. The series has been running for 30 years, but for me, Samurai Showdown 4 was the game that really elevated the series. The swordplay was incredible. I think for me, everything about this game just works. The sprites are beautifully designed, the animations are beautifully fluid, the gameplay and the way that it flows and it just really feels really tight to control and play. Obviously the backgrounds look absolutely beautiful with various parallax scaling effects and just really enhance the characters and the look of the game. So Virtua Fighter Kids is just literally Virtua Fighter 2 shrunk down with kids, effectively. And whilst it doesn't hit the highs of its older brother, it's still actually a very fun game with some great bright enhanced visuals and some really good fun mechanics going on that weren't seen in Virtua Fighter. The way that the camera shifts and the animated backgrounds are excellent. It's slightly frustrating at times. I didn't really appreciate the very short stubby legs when you're trying to kick, but aside from that, this is a lot of fun and a very accessible game. If you're looking for more Virtua Fighter, this is definitely something you should pick up. Back in the day where EA was far more experimental with its lineup, Rabbit was a very interesting fighting game that they published just in Japan. Now, it only had 8 characters. The roster wasn't particularly large. However, each character was beautifully designed with a huge amount of detail. And for me, that really sets this game apart. I'm glad this game exists because it really is something different and on a system that was swimming in fighting games, to have something slightly different and slightly quirkier was definitely interesting. I really enjoyed this one. It's a shame that we didn't get this on European shores, and if you want to try a different 2D fighting game, you should definitely take a look at Rabbit. At a time when 3D arcade ports were, whilst technically impressive, nowhere near what was happening in the arcades, Capcom was bringing almost arcade-perfect conversions of their CPS2 hardware to the Saturn, and Night Warriors Darkstalkers Revenge is undoubtedly one of the almost arcade-perfect conversions that they brought out. Whether it's the incredible animations or the incredibly interesting and very fun character set, this was one of the go-to fighting games at the time, and the whole series, I think, just doesn't get enough recognition for how good it is. If for some reason you've never played a Darkstalkers game, or Vampire Savior as it was called in Japan, then you should definitely try and pick one of these up, because it's a huge amount of fun that holds up to this day. Waku Waku 7 is certainly an interesting game. On the one hand, it feels quite small, there's not that many characters, and the amount of backgrounds are quite limited. On the other hand though, the characters that are there and their incredible animations and sprite design, as well as the gorgeous moving interactive backgrounds, that are just bursting with colour and bursting with, I think, personality. This game really is a huge amount of fun and joy to play. And whilst it may not be the deepest experience, I still think that this is a game that shines because of that visual design today, and is definitely worth a look. Fighting Vipers was a very good conversion of the Model 2 arcade game, and it really was the anti-Virtua Fighter in many ways. A crazy, just amped up character set of insane individuals. You had cages rather than ring outs, you had destructible armor, and the whole game was just really, really interesting. It ran a little bit faster, and sadly when they brought the conversion to the Saturn, they did use the lower res mode, which definitely doesn't give it the same pop as, of course, the 480i Virtua Fighter 2 graphics. However, the game is still extremely fun. It's fast paced. It's definitely one of the 3D games that you should look up. There is a great Xbox Live version, which it's definitely worth looking into before that one gets delisted. It was also on PlayStation Network on the PS3, so highly recommend that you try this one, because it's one of those classic 3D games which I think now has been forgotten. There was a Model 3 sequel which wasn't as good, but the Saturn version was definitely a very, very respectable 3D conversion. So Astra Superstars is just missing out on the top 10, and it's an absolutely crazy, bonkers, flight-based 2D fighter, and in very much was the spiritual successor to Waku Waku 7, and that really comes through here. A lot of the things that are true about Waku Waku 7 in terms of the bright, fantastic colours, incredible animations, and incredible energy. They just make this a real joy to play. The sad thing about this one is if you want to pick this one up, it's incredibly expensive now. Easily 3 figures. You'll pay £100 or dollars, or potentially more, which is a real shame because it's one of many fantastic 32-bit fighting games which probably dies on the Saturn, which is extremely sad. So into the top 10, and we're kicking off with an absolutely cracking game, which is Real Bout Fatal Fury Special. Now, you can see here just from looking at the images, the animations are absolutely gorgeous. It's incredible to play, and when you look at the backgrounds and the amount of intricate detail going on, I mean, it easily looks like a 2D game that would be released on modern hardware today. It's utterly stunning. The combos can get crazy at times, and the whole game is just excellent. This was originally a Neo Geo game that was ported to the Saturn, and using the Saturn's additional RAM, they did a phenomenal job with this conversion. It's still fun. I would still play this today if it was a modern arcade game. Real Bout Fatal Fury Special is at number 10. So Capcom in the 90s decided to take their Marvel superheroes game and blend it with Street Fighter Alpha, and the result is the excellent Marvel superheroes versus Street Fighter. Now, they literally did just blast these games together, and the reason that this isn't higher on the list is there's a little bit of a balancing issue with some of the characters feeling overpowered, but overall this is still a wonderful game, and it almost felt back in the day like a stealth drop. This wasn't really hyped in any way. It just, bam, it appeared in the arcades, and it's a phenomenal game to play even to this day. Sadly, as with so many games on this list, only got a Saturn release in Japan, but well worth a look. It's so much fun to play, and to see the Street Fighter cast face off against Marvel characters, especially with the Marvel Revolution that we've had post-2008, is really something special. So if you can pick this one up on import, definitely take a look at X-Men vs Street Fighter. So number 8 is Last Bronx, and actually the fact that this game exists on the Saturn is pretty incredible, really. I did an Impossible Ports video not so long ago, and this one definitely should have featured. You have to remember that this was the Model 2C arcade board, which was even more powerful than Model 2 hardware. It was an enhanced version, and this game featured stunning 60 frames per second frame rate, weapons combat, full 3D backgrounds, and the whole thing comes across obviously with some cutbacks and carefully tweaked visuals. But the whole game comes across intact and is very, very playable, and it remains one of those fantastic 3D fighting games that you can still play to this day. Now, it's nothing on the arcade version, but the Saturn does port the spirit of the game, and it arrives intact, and it's a great game at number 8. Vampire Savior, or Darkstalkers 3 as it was known here in Europe, where it didn't get a release. This is a PlayStation Europe exclusive. It only came out in Japan for the Saturn. Thankfully though, the fans have got involved. There is an English translation of this game, and I'm very happy that there is, because it takes the Night Warriors Darkstalkers Revenge, the second game, and just ups the ante in every single way with more fluid animations, better moveset, more characters, more backgrounds, everything. It's the second game just on steroids, and it works so well. Like I say, if you haven't played this series, if you've missed it, then Vampire Savior is the pinnacle of the series. They saved the best for the end of the trilogy. You should absolutely check this one out if you can. The King of Fighters, another classic SNK Neo Geo fighting game that had an incredibly huge roster and just these incredibly detailed, beautifully animated 2D visuals that you can see here. And I think many people consider King of Fighters 97, or at least the games around that period, to be, even now, the pinnacle of the series. And going back and replaying these, I can see why, because there's an incredibly deep, intricate fighting engine in here, and it just strips things back to a more basic time. It utilized the Saturn's 4MB RAM card, which meant you got more animations and just this beautiful fluid game. If for some reason you haven't played one of the classic Neo Geo games, you definitely have to. I think if you're a fighting fan, you owe it to go back and try King of Fighters, because the game is excellent. It still holds up today, and I personally think King of Fighters 97 is the best in the series, and the Saturn conversion was excellent. Back in the 90s, Fighters Megamix was basically a 3D fighting gamer's dream. It bought the character roster from Virtua Fighter and Fighting Vipers, Sega's two premier 3D franchises at the time, and basically merged them together, adding a whole host of fun extras with additional characters from Sonic the Fighters and even a Daytona USA car. It really was a fantastic game that I hope they remake or make a sequel of one day, because there was so much depth. The game actually had the control system and a lot of moves from the Virtua Fighter 3 arcade game, which made the controls really deep. The only downside was that they went for the low resolution Fighting Vipers visual style, which I think took a lot away from the Virtua Fighter characters. And obviously there were no ring outs, etc. So it was just plain, fairly bland floors and canvases that you fought on, which I think gave it a visually less pleasing look a lot of the time. But that doesn't take anything away from the fact that this was a wonderful game, and please, Sega, if you're ever listening, bring this one back. So Dead or Alive, despite not being a Sega game, was originally a Model 2 game, and the original game, this series really found notoriety through the excellent Dreamcast sequel and of course then the exclusive Xbox release that came out. But the first game really was the one that kicked things off, and it is, without question, one of the most beautiful games on the Saturn. I actually think this looks better than Virtua Fighter 2, which is seen really as the benchmark in terms of visuals for the system. I think that this is better. I think that, they've ditched ring outs. Instead, you have like an electrified section that you can be knocked onto. And the whole game, actually, from an accessibility point of view for a 3D fighter, it's very, very easy to pick up and get into, more so than the Virtua Fighter or Fighting Vipers series. So that's why this, for me, is so highly regarded. I really think that the first game is very, very underrated and is an excellent game that everybody should play. So Dead or Alive is at number 4. You can tell now by this stage absolutely every game, and this is a testament to the strength of fighting games on the Saturn. I talk about it like it's the number 1 game, and that really is the way that this feels. It was incredibly hard to differentiate between even 10 and 1. But X-Men vs Street Fighter, for me, is the strongest of all of the crossover games, simply because I think the characters balance themselves out so much better. This had a lot of new modes. Like I say, the characters all just worked. When you see Wolverine beating up Ryu, it feels right, and I think that's what really differentiates this one for me. The whole game just feels perfect and it's just so much fun to play. I could still play this now. I still do play this now with friends. It's definitely worth looking up. Sadly, again, another Japan-only conversion for the Saturn, which is absolutely criminal for a game of this caliber. But at least we got this game in some form on the console, and it's very, very playable if you're not Japanese speaking, like so many of these fighting games. Most of the dialogue and text is in English anyway. If you haven't played this one, play it, like every single game on the top 10 of this list. So at number 2 is the legendary Virtua Fighter 2, and as conversions go, this is one of the best arcade ports that you will ever see. It runs in the Saturn's high resolution mode. It looks absolutely gorgeous. When Sega ported the original Virtua Fighter and Daytona USA, I did not have much hope for this one when they said they were moving Virtua Fighter 2 across, but they absolutely nailed it with gorgeous 3D characters, 2D backgrounds that you wouldn't know were 2D, and using the Saturn's infinite plane to create this sense of scale and depth that you just hadn't seen in 3D fighters. The whole game is perfection. It plays beautifully. The moveset and the characters, the additional characters, Shun and Leon, I forgot his name for a second, they are just perfect additions to the roster that just enhanced this game over the first. But it was such a big technological leap. For me, this was stronger than Tekken, and it really is a pièce de résistance in terms of the Saturn, and certainly the best 3D fighter on the system. So number 2 is Virtua Fighter 2. So number 1, and this is a game that needs no introduction, and it's the absolutely bordering on perfect Street Fighter Alpha 3, now known as Street Fighter 03 in Japan, where again, sadly, this was a Japanese only release on the Saturn. This was almost arcade perfect, and it just does everything right. It's got an incredible roster of characters, all of which offer something different. They're not just reskinned versions of each other. There really genuinely is a huge amount of depth here, a huge amount of modes, absolutely stunning visuals. And Street Fighter Alpha 3, 30 years on from the Saturn's release, it's not just the best fighting game on the Saturn. There's an argument out there that it may be one of the best fighting games of all time and still holds up even when judged against modern standards. I absolutely love this one. It's the Saturn version for me is the best console version that you can play. They did release a max version on the PSP. I don't think it compares. I just think this is absolutely fantastic. So yeah, if for some reason this one's passed you by, find a way to play this game because it is excellent. Guys, I hope you enjoyed it. It's great to do another Saturn list. As always, like and subscribe. It helps me out. And as always, have a great day.